This is episode 206 of Zen and the Art of Real Estate Investing with my guest, Ladislas Maurice. Ladislas is dedicated to helping others navigate global investing. He's an international investor and consultant with experience in nearly 100 countries. He's lived in at least 12 of them, speaks at least 5 languages. This is going to be fun. Ladislas, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you, Jonathan?
Doing great. And I should say you're the founder of The Wandering Investor because that's what it says down there. And that's what I want to get into, though. When you were growing up, were you thinking about real estate and travel, or is it something that you came to after your time? Because I know you work globally at Nestle.
So I grew up with my parents taking me around a lot. My father was a university professor, and he would just get contracts in random universities in North America, Europe, the Middle East, etc. And I would just tag along. So as a teenager, I just traveled around a lot, and I figured I would continue doing that. And then I added business to it.
Yeah, that probably was pretty fun. Probably hard to maintain the friendships and stuff because this is maybe, before everything on social media was as easy as it is now.
Yeah, no, it was pretty hard. Because because effectively when you live this way, you're always the new kid in school, right?
Right.
So it's not only a new school, but it's also a new school and a new culture. So you have to learn all the codes, etc. Then it takes about 2 years to become cool, right? And then once you start becoming cool, then your parents take you somewhere else, and then you're in the new kid again.
Yeah. Well, culturally, that obviously has significance to what you do now, because operating and trying to buy real estate and understand real estate in all of these different areas and countries certainly comes with differentiators in each area culturally and just operationally, right?
Absolutely. It really helps build tolerance for ambiguity, which is absolutely necessary, especially when you operate in emerging markets.
Yeah, it's funny because if you just operate like in an American market, people would say like, hey, ambiguity is going to get you in trouble. But if you're going outside, you really have to have that because you can't come in thinking that you know everything into a new area. You'll never be able to buy property.
Yeah, exactly. And these markets by nature are very ambiguous. There isn't data like there is in the US. So, specifically for real estate in the US, Canada, et cetera, we're pretty lucky. We have the MLS. There's literally all the information you need. You start going into Latin America, actually most of Europe, even Western Europe, there's nothing. There's very little data out there. So it's ambiguous, and there's inherently a bit more risk in transactions because there's a wider gap in knowledge between you and the locals.
Yeah, and that's where you need to build up more or know somebody like yourself who can navigate in those markets, because you really can be off balance. Because I think I've even heard in some areas, realtors don't need any training at all. Not that they're well trained in America, but like you can just pick up in another country and say, today I think I'm going to sell a house today. And you can. Am I correct on that?
Yeah. I mean, most realtors I work with in emerging markets just, one day woke up and said they're realtor.
It's funny. It's not that different in America, even though it's 90 hours of training. It still seems to work out in a similar fashion. But let's go back. While you were doing all this traveling, and then as you got into your international job, when did you start thinking that you might transition to real estate?
It was a gradual process. So when I was working at Nestle in South Africa, I had made my first real estate investment, actually in the US and in Texas.
Oh, interesting.
And then I started making other investments in Eastern Europe and West Africa, et cetera. So when I decided to leave my corporate career at the age of 30, because I had spent at that point 7 years with Nestle, mostly in Africa, a little bit in Switzerland, mostly in Africa. I already had a bit of experience in real estate, and then it became a full-time thing.
Is the banking and money transfer and then also mortgages, are mortgages an issue or do you have to really be buying cash most of the time for this to work out?
Yeah, very good question. It's a topic that North Americans typically struggle with, in the sense that North Americans have such easy access to credit.
Really? Yeah.
When you venture overseas, in the vast majority of cases, you don't have access to credit locally,
Right.
especially if you venture into emerging markets.
Yeah.
Western Europe, in some cases, even then, you'll be paying much higher rates than locals. They'll be asking for much higher deposit, and the paperwork will be insane. So in most cases, it's a cash purchase. You can get credit back home, back in Canada, back in the US. That works.
Yeah.
Dangerous because often currency fluctuation. So people need to be aware of this. And then the banking, it really depends on your bank. Look, there are no capital controls in the US nor in Canada, so you legally can just wire money out. That's not a problem.
Right.
The issue is rather with compliance departments of banks, where you need to just prep them. So, for example, if you're going to,
I want to spring it on them the night before. Hey,
yeah,
I'm just about to close on something in Croatia tomorrow.
yeah, exactly, and just try to wire 300K to Croatia, like that's just not going to go well. So, before doing that, you just call your banker. It's like, hey, John, I'm going to go to Croatia. I want to buy a place. Just letting you know, can you increase the limits on my online banking for international wires?
Yeah.
What's your email so that I can send the purchase contract to you before making the transfer, so that if compliance asks for it, you can send it to
You
me.
have it already.
But if you do this, in 99% of cases, you won't have any issues. The issue is people who, and that's happened sometimes. They go overseas, they sign a contract, they put like 2% down in cash or whatever, and then they want to send the rest before a certain date, and then their bank is what, and then they can't, and then they lose their deposit. So just with a bit of planning, this doesn't happen.
When you started buying those first couple properties, because they were in drastically different areas, are you buying condos, single family homes? What's it like when you're buying out of the country? Is it safer to buy condos, townhouses, where you have some form of, I guess, a little bit of help, maybe with an HOA or something? Or single family houses, it really depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah, it really depends on the market. Every market is different. So the way I operate is I focus, for example, I'll see a country. I'm like, okay, this looks like an interesting macro story. Then I go there and I'll spend a few weeks or a few months in that country asking myself, how do I play it? Right. So for example, a few years ago, I went to Uzbekistan. The country was just emerging from a rough communist dictatorship. They had just not elected, but a new guy came into power, and he was rolling out the red carpet for foreign investors. So I went there with the thinking, I want to buy real estate. I went there. I saw that legally, in the type of real estate that looked interesting, you couldn't buy as a foreigner. But you could if you used a local company, but then you weren't allowed to rent it out, but people were doing it and getting away with it. And they were just emerging out of this phase. And it was a little too risky for me. So I continued looking around, and then I saw that they had a stock market in Uzbekistan, right? Who would have thought? So I started digging in there. And then I found companies that had P ratios of like 2 or 3, that had dividend yields of 15, 20%, that had zero debt on their balance sheets, and that were growing like 30, 40% a year.
Yeah.
So this looks a little bit more straightforward than real estate. So, in that case, I went for real estate. Recently, I know 2-3 years ago, I was looking at Serbia because of its unique geopolitical position, where it's in Europe, but it's not fully aligned with the West, and it's not fully aligned with the East. It's playing in between the EU, Russia, China, with a lot of Gulf investment. And I thought it was interesting what they were up to. And I could see a lot of FDI was going to come into the country. And I went there, and, the stock market was just completely liquid, unreformed. They had crazy rules, like if you sell stocks, your money is stuck in your brokerage account for 6 months until you pay capital gains locally. Just like ridiculous stuff. And then real estate was already quite expensive. It was more expensive than Budapest in the EU. So I just wasn't comfortable. And I didn't find a way to play it. I didn't know how to play Serbia. Turns out I was wrong. Real estate continued going up. It was expensive. Now it's extremely expensive.